welcome to this session, which is focused on the future of central business districts, with a particular focus on those in Britain and those big British central business districts that we see across the country. I'm Andrew Carter, Chief Executive Centre for Cities. My guests today in this session are NISHANT SODHANI, who's the Director of Future Cities and New Industries at HSBC, and NATHALIE HAKIM. NATHALIE is the Portfolio Director at Grosvenor. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So just a few words of context. I think it's useful for those that are kind of joining us. We've been looking at the recovery of our cities and town centres, our CBDs across the country. And what's noticeable as a trend, I think, is that our big urban areas, not just London, but Leeds and Manchester and Birmingham, they were obviously massively affected going into COVID, but they've been the slowest in terms of recovery as well. And that's partly because essentially, what they were before COVID was huge hubs of office activity. And essentially those workers have gone home. They took their work home with them overnight. And that's had a huge effect for them, but also for all the services jobs that then relied upon them, the restaurants and the bars and the gyms and the cafes and all that. So kind of big cities are really struggling, and their city centres have been struggling. We're talking in October, and they are recovering, but they're still the slowest compared to smaller and medium-sized places. So I think that's a bit of context. And the obvious question there is, what's going to happen to office work? And then what does that mean for our central business districts, which have traditionally been the place where office work has typically happened? So, Natalie, come to you first. Just give us your context for a bit of thinking about how COVID has affected Grosvenor and the way that you've thought about, CBDs and the investments that you've got. And then similarly with you, Nishant, and we'll open it up into a broader conversation. So, Natalie, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Grosvenor, we're a family-owned property business with a 300-year history. And the core of our estate is in Mayfair and Belgravia in the West End of London. So we've been around for a long time, and we've experienced a number of crises over that time. So COVID was clearly a huge shock for everybody in the property industry. And we had to react quite quickly, like everybody. We have thousands of tenants on our London estate, and we had to react very quickly to support them during the pandemic. So we offered a package of rental support, in particular to our retailers who were forced to close. But we've also taken a very bespoke approach to all sectors, actually. We've really got to know our tenants very well, actually, as a result. So one-to-one conversations between asset managers and tenants, which is fantastic, and is something I really, really hope we all continue to do going forward. And fundamentally, we've got to know our tenants much better. And the other things that we've done, we've created a tenant investment fund, which is looking at supporting tenants with their expansion at a time like this, where actually bank finance is quite tricky. So it's this whole idea of mutual success. We're looking for our tenants and our customers to succeed, and we will all succeed, I think, as a result.
So if the short term, in a sense, was helping your tenants to deal with the circumstances that they found themselves in, how did that then play out in the way that Grosvenor thought about its business and the decisions it was making? Obviously, been around for 300 years. 18 months is a kind of relatively short time in that period. You talked about Belgravia and Mayfair has gone through various and many iterations of what it is, what it's been, and probably what it will be. But just put that in the context of how then Grosvenor took a step back and thought about what that meant for the business.
Absolutely. So we have a business strategy that was actually renewed last year, so just before the pandemic. And what I would say is exactly that, Andrew. We're a long-term business with very long-term investment horizons. So we're not looking to change our strategy very quickly. We make decisions for the long term. And fundamentally, what I would say is that strategy has remained the same throughout the pandemic and even now. But of course, we need to react, we need to innovate as we see these shocks in the market. So I think that will always happen. But the fundamentals of the business, I think, will remain the same.
That's interesting. So we'll come back to that in a sense of, how those kind of fundamentals allow you to weather the storm almost, of the immediate. Nishant, obviously HSBC, is an equally, old established organisation, albeit in different guises and such. But just tell us a little bit about, the effect that COVID has had on the nature of the business, particularly as you think about, cities and real estate.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Andrew. And thank you, Natalie. I think a lot of these points will resonate because similar to what Natalie said, I think we, like all major or large organizations, we have to had to react to this. And I think COVID for many of the firms has been more of an accelerator and catalyst for change. So a lot of the evolution in the real estate space has been active before the pandemic itself, but we see that COVID has acted as a catalyst for a lot of the change, particularly in terms of technology, digitalization, and things like that. Now, as you mentioned, HSBC is a big employer and sort of big tenant as well, occupier of large office space, particularly in business districts in London and Birmingham, here based in 8 Canada Square in Canary Wharf and in 1 Centenary Square at Birmingham, central Birmingham. I think for us, we, as Natalie mentioned, the cities have been quite resilient over centuries, to be fair, and we are living in the century of cities where, more than 50% of populations are living in urban centers, and it's going to increase to, say, close to 80% by 2030. So I think in that regard, I would say that for HSBC, we have been able to adapt to it. So a lot of our work was done virtually through hybrid working, but we're now slowly getting back to offices once again, and it's quite flexible right now. So the hybrid working is the name of the game right now. But more importantly, it's also the adaptations of the workplace itself. So the workplace is moving from being work-centric to worker-centric. So what we see is that a lot of collaboration space, a lot of space for co-working, and likewise. And one of the features of our headquarters building in Birmingham is that it's one of the first buildings to be constructed to LEED Gold standard in Birmingham, with sustainability at the heart of the design. And I think that's the future for the space as a whole, is sustainability, and how do you make it more green and make it more worker friendly.
And those are two good examples where sustainability and the green element, the green footprint of our buildings, and actually making them spaces that are not just for people to be in and doing their job, but actually to be more experiential in the way that they collaborate. Those are trends that were, we observed them before the pandemic, and we, obviously the pandemic has made us kind of fundamentally rethink them again, but actually it's a continuation of. Is that right?
It is, indeed. And in terms of that, I mean, if you look at it, HSBC has been big supporter of a lot of real estate players, including Grosvenor, but also more recently, we've sort of helped Argent related on the green office development in King's Cross, the urban regeneration project in King's Cross. Similarly, we've helped Derwent London in terms of their green revolving credit facility for their London-based real estate trust, investment trust. So I think you see that a lot of the big real estate players are adapting to this trend, and they are engaging into more and more green, sustainable developments, and I think that's really here to stay.
And sustainability is a big theme for Grosvenor, Natalie, kind of thinking about not only here and now, but actually probably the next 300 years, I suppose.
Exactly that, and it's a real core part of our business. Sustainability is at the heart of everything that we do, and I agree, it's something that everybody was clearly aware of before COVID. We have a climate emergency that we're all working towards, improving and resolving. So every decision that we make, every investment decision that we make has sustainability at the heart of it. We've recently launched a new investment strategy looking at UK regional cities. And any building that we buy on the estate and in the regions, we will look to improve the sustainability credentials of those buildings to a high standard, because we think that's what office occupiers want to do. We're clearly looking to reduce the energy consumption of all of our buildings, and we have a really big ongoing project to do that across our whole estate and supply chain and customers. But fundamentally, it adds value. People value this now, and our tenants, our customers, everybody in our spaces are looking for, buildings where their health will be taken into consideration, where well-being is a really important factor, where there's open green space and biodiversity. So I completely agree with what Nishant's been saying.
And just carrying on in that sort of space, Natalie, I mean, you mentioned Grosvenor been around for a very long time, big footprint in and around Belgravia, Mayfair, parts of London. More recently, you've got big presence in Liverpool, and actually you've been purchasing buildings, actually purchased them during the pandemic in Birmingham city centre and indeed Manchester, the northern quarter, as it were, the sort of funky area of Manchester city centre. Just say a little bit about why those buildings, why do it at a time when, lots of people are really questioning whether our city centres and our central business districts are over, in a sense, that was the time that was, and the time in the future is going to be different. So why now and why there?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And like I mentioned at the beginning, the strategy was set before the pandemic, and we've continued to pursue that. So yes, the Northern Quarter in Manchester and Edmund Street in Birmingham is where we've acquired buildings. And fundamentally, this is a part of the business that's looking to diversify further and outside of London and into the regions, which is something Grosvenor's done for many, many years. As you mentioned, we have a big footprint in Liverpool, and we manage Liverpool One in Liverpool city centre. And we are looking in this part of the business to invest for income. But we're also looking, as I've previously mentioned, to improve all of the buildings that we acquire. So we fundamentally believe in the future of the CBD, and that's why we're doing it. So we're looking at Manchester, Birmingham, and other top-tier regional cities like Bristol and Leeds as well.
It's good to hear that there's a strong case for continuation of our CBDs. I think it's a lot of the conversation, which strikes me as wrong, but nevertheless suggests the CBDs are somewhat over and that they're old school and they serve no purpose. And I think your decisions suggest otherwise, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's more than just the office community.
Yes.
I think a CBD is really an ecosystem of many different sectors and uses. So of course you've got the office hubs all around the country, but those are sort of underpinned by great amenity in a residential community, whether that's immediately in the vicinity of the office district or commutable. And I think all of that has to work together. Otherwise, I do think that CBDs will struggle if they don't have those kind of supporting uses. Yeah,
and we'll come on to that maybe about where you think they are currently and how they might evolve and what new uses might need to be brought into. But Nishant, HSBC, big presence obviously in London, but increasingly a big presence in Birmingham. That's very much a flagship scheme. Again, centrally located, right in the heart of the CBD.
Yeah.
A continued commitment to that. Just your thoughts on that? I mean, what is it that HSBC sees in Birmingham city centre?
Well, I think Birmingham is sort of the growth engine for not only sort of the West Midlands, but UK as a whole. Mm-hmm. And I think, we as HSBC, as Midlands Bank, previously, we've had a long history and connection with the Midlands and Birmingham. And I think we wanted to be closer to our roots, and that's why Birmingham. And as Natalie suggested, I think it's it's just the continuation of a strategy. I think while yes, we've adapted to post-pandemic measures and we've made it more flexible working, and we've also adapted our sort of office infrastructure around that. But I think it does not sway our commitment to the region, to the city, and the CBD. And as Natalie suggested, I think I completely concur with that it's not just the office, it's the whole ecosystem around the CBD, including the amenities, including the service providers, including sort of the transport infrastructure, the utilities who provide energy and etc. So I think it's the whole ecosystem that is there that sort of supports the growth of these central business districts and office clusters.
Yeah. And is that the real sort of offer of these sorts of locations? Natalie's, they're super well connected. They have a real mix and variety of amenities, which appeals to a kind of broader set of, they're good places to work in a broad sense. They're attractive to the talent that you want. Is that the offer? Is that why they continue to be attractive places for you to do business?
I think that's exactly right, and I agree with the infrastructure point, which I hadn't mentioned previously. But HS2 is clearly a big factor in those. But ultimately, yes, they're successful cities. We think they'll attract talent, and therefore we think businesses will want to be there.
Yeah. Now, the risk is, we may all well be wrong when people watch this in 12 months' time, but let's assume for a minute that some of the remote working that we've seen and some of the hybrid working that we've seen sticks. We can debate, where we think it's going to stick, but let's assume that for a while at least, people are kind of coming into the office individually less often, 2 to 3 days a week or whatever it might be. What does that do for the offer? I mean, from an investment point of view, from an occupier view, how does that affect how you then think about real estate and how you use it?
Yeah, I think that's a key question for all investors, I think, at the moment.
Absolutely.
And I don't think we yet have an answer to it. But what I would say is that CBDs, landlords, investors, property owners, they will need to work a lot harder, I think, to attract businesses. And businesses themselves need to work very hard to attract their workers and employees. And ultimately, they want to attract the best talent. So I think we will see a flight to quality here where office occupiers are going to be looking for the best-in-class buildings, the best-in-class locations. And as an investor and as representing a landowner, we will always strive to create and manage the best places for our office occupiers and the wider neighbourhoods. So I think it's hard to say at the moment where it will settle, but fundamentally we believe at the moment I think the consensus is that people think we'll come back at about 80% of where we were, and I think it's the sort of services and the extra things that will need to be in place that people will be looking for.
And so do you think the kind of classic, very traditional, probably outmoded already, but very traditional landlord, tenant relationship, sign a lease, 15 years, ideal, good covenant and carry on. I mean, is that gone? Is that ended? Is it going to be, by definition, are we going to be more flexible? Are buildings themselves going to have many tenants in them rather than necessarily one tenant, which often, investors often prefer?
I mean, that's a trend that we were seeing even before COVID. So we've been seeing that kind of demand for flexibility and slightly shorter leases actually before the pandemic. But that, as a landlord, that's something that we're very much focusing on. So I think choice is the key question here. So tenants, occupiers, workers even, they're looking for choice. And we're always looking to provide that to our tenants. So we can offer a range from an office headquarters all the way down to a monthly membership to a serviced office. And having that flexibility and being able to offer that, I think, is really key, because then you sort of appeal to the wider spectrum of customers.
Yeah. And Nishant, obviously, you're an investor, you're a partner, you're a financier, you're an occupier.
Yeah.
Your reflection of this kind of hybrid work, I mean, particularly, think about Birmingham, for example. I mean, where do you think it's going to settle? Will it settle at 2 to 3 days? And what does that mean for the use of your space and your building? How is that evolving? How is your thinking evolving on that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Andrew. Again, as Natalie said, it's the jury is out on it yet, and there's a lot of uncertainty around it. I think it will take some time before this particular pattern of hybrid working and everything will settle down eventually, right? So, for example, at HSBC, we've given the employees have been provided the flexibility to at this point in time choose how they want to get back to work, and how much time they would like to spend and how they would like to make it. And I think that's an ongoing process. It has a big impact on the ecosystem. So of course, when you think about the whole infrastructure that has been put in place, it's not put in place for 2 or 3 days a week. It's been put in place for, say, 7 days a week, right? To be fair. And I think the important point is, how do we balance it off? How do we make sure when people are coming in on a few days in a week, we still getting 100% utilization of the space? Yeah. So can we support more number of employees at the same time by spreading it across the week? Also, in terms of, I think the whole focus is shifting to the experience of employees. So I think in order to attract the employees back into office, it has to be more than just in workplace. It has to be an experience for them where they come in, not only in terms of collaboration with their colleagues, which is quite important. We are, after all, social animals, and we need that human interaction, which was missing in sort of the hybrid working or work from home kind of an environment. So I think there are these virtues of office which are quite critical. And even from a business perspective, I think office, the whole brand identity, the culture, the training, the collaboration, all of these are critical from an employer perspective as well. So there would be a lot of focus for employers to create that conducive atmosphere for employees so that they feel, one, confident, safe, and they feel excited to come back to office. And then the ecosystem around it flourishes as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. All of that sort of, I mean, in some sense, it's good common sense, right? We should be doing that whether COVID had happened or not. So, I mean, has COVID sort of sharpened the thinking on it? And I guess people have been able to, or realize that they can work from home, maybe they didn't previously appreciate that they could do that. And so that sharpens then, on the behalf of the employer, that they have to work a bit harder in terms of the offer that they're then making to the worker. Is that fair? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also depends from sector to sector, Andrew. So it's not that this sort of applies to all sort of sectors or all employees across the board. Take, for example, a lot of professional services can work in a hybrid environment, but also there are some regulatory constraints that require you to work from office space and things like that. So I think it has to be a balance of it, and there are some sectors where you have to be on the work site and there's no choice to work from home in that space. It also has an impact on the overall city as a whole, not just the central business district, because you would see a lot more distributed urbanization in terms of the growth centers not just being restricted to the city centers, but you would see a lot of different localities within the city, different office clusters within the city coming up with a lot more of these amenities and ecosystem developing there.
Yeah.
So that's also an opportunity for the city to grow and in a more distributed way, I would say.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Natalie, I mean, some of the criticism of central business districts is that they are, they're too sort of mono-use, either maybe too dominated by retail. We see that in some of our city centres, far too much retail. In others, too dominated by commercial space or office buildings, often, looking very similar, tall, glass. I mean, what's your view on that? In a sense, that dominance, is that right? And if so, what does that then tell us about how we might see the next iteration, the next evolution of our CBDs? And is that the kind of thing that the traits that Grosvenor's looking to avoid or looking to encourage?
Yeah, I would say we're definitely looking to avoid that.
So if you're very mono-use, don't expect Grosvenor to come to your place anytime soon.
I think that, COVID has sort of highlighted it in a way, that the recovery and the bounce back has been a lot more successful in places that are multi-use, mixed use, where you have a strong residential population, or where you have, an amenity or an entertainment element to it, where people are kind of attracted to come there not just for work. And I think that is kind of a trend that we're going to see continue. It's not enough just to provide an office space now. I think people have the choice, and they're going to want to be in places that are attractive, that offer more than just, a desk, in an office, in a Skyrise office. So I think we're seeing examples of that. For example, Canary Wharf, I think, are doing really well actually at, diversifying the uses in that area. They have a big residential pipeline, and they have, they've had retail there for a while, but I think that will improve. And the City of London, we've seen that actually, a lot of data around, hardly anyone going back there at the moment, which is quite contrasted actually to the areas, some of our areas in the West End.
And the City of London traditionally, odd occasions, but traditionally has actually been against lots of residents coming back into the square mile over time, in part because of the tensions that it often brings then between different uses. Residents wanted to be quiet and workers maybe, less so, particularly of an evening or early in the morning with deliveries. I wonder whether, this move towards mixed use, which is often talked about as being an unallied good, Nishant, there are some tensions associated with it, right? Or not? Can they be managed?
Yeah, I'm sure they can be managed, because when you're saying mixed use, you're, as Natalie would say, as Grosvenor the landlord would look after all their tenants and would like to balance the interest and things like that. So I think, for example, Canary Wharf or any of these places, or the central London area where it's majority of high street spaces, I think you have to move towards mixed use. You have to make sure you're using your space optimally and it's fit for future. So I think in some places there would be a need for intentional repurposing in order to make it fit for future if it is not already. And I think that over a period of time you would have seen that all cities have adapted, and that's how cities have been resilient, really. So this is again one of those factors which has been accelerated because of the pandemic, but it was heading that way anyways. The mixed use developments have been coming all over the places. So if you see large developments, for example, I mentioned King's Cross. Now they're doing their next project in Brent Cross Town, which is again a very sizable development, but also a mixed use, multi-purpose development. So you have residential, office, and also how to make use of, for example, waste to heat energy to provide district heating, and all sustainable sort of goals around it. So I think that's really how the developers are thinking for when it comes to future of how they can make it more multi-purpose, more mixed use, so that they're not those monotonous buildings of just glass and workspace.
And that's the kind of neighbourhood that the Northern Quarter in Manchester is. I mean, when you go there, it's very mixed use. It's very human scale. There's a lot of variety going on. Different types of businesses, different types of uses. Some city centre living. I presume that's exactly the kind of places that you're looking for opportunities.
Absolutely.
More generally.
Absolutely. And I think we see a lot of potential, in particular in the Northern Quarter, for exactly that kind of neighbourhood. Exactly.
Yeah. One area I want to just get your thoughts on, what we know about CBDs and city centres more generally is, all the analysis tells us, super productive, super creative. They are the real sort of hubs of the modern economy, where it really happens. Also super expensive in many respects, right? I mean, rents typically higher, commercial and or residential, and workers and firms are making, they're making trade-offs, making choices about where they locate because of that. It's not like they're going there because it's cheap; they're going there for other reasons. Should we worry about the increasing costs of being in our city centres, whether you're a worker or if you're a firm? Is that something that we should be mindful about? I mean, from a real estate point of view, investor or developer, you might like that, but I mean, just in a broader sense, is it something we should be thinking carefully about?
I think, it's an interesting challenge, and clearly London is an expensive place to have an office, live, have a shop, etc. But I think for me, if I were a business owner, it's thinking about an investment in your own business. Why would you do that? Because you attract the best talent, because they want to be in the best places. It's because the buildings are of a high quality. You have a choice there, but ideally you're going to go for the best buildings and the best locations. And I think that does come, it comes as a premium because there is the demand and the competition for it. So.
Nishan, your thoughts on that? In a sense, should we worry about, or just to recognise and accept that there are trade-offs and firms and workers will make those decisions based on what they think they're going to get from being in a location compared to the costs?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they, as we mentioned earlier, there is that flight to quality. So there would always be those places that will command that premium, places that are, especially takes all the boxes in terms of sustainability, in terms of being good, buildings with lots of amenities and located in sort of prime locations. So there will always be an element of premium attached to such properties and places. But I think one of the ways of how it can become a bit more equitable is through this distributed urbanization. As more places in and around the city centers come up, I think that would give more opportunities and spaces for mixed use developments to come in, not just office, residential, all of it. And I think that could provide opportunities that may not be as expensive. But yeah, that has been a typical trade-off for employers and employees all through the time.
Yeah, no, quite. And start to bring to a close, but I want to come back to the point you made, Natalie, and you just touched on the end, Nishant, about this flight to quality. What does that mean for places that are not necessarily in that bracket? You know, it's a broader question about, you know, the future of our urban areas and the future of our city centres outside of the ones that, like Birmingham or Manchester or London or Liverpool, that have a scale and a prestige and a brand that allow them to evolve over time and, you know, progressively become better. I mean, what's your thinking about the trends as they apply to some of those secondary or tertiary places? Natalie, what's your thoughts on that?
My personal view is that, you know, we'll divert, you know, those two will diverge.
Yeah.
So, you know, in times like this, in times of crisis, people are always going to move towards the quality assets. And that's why, you know, we're investing in that way. We're looking for quality buildings in quality locations. So that's my personal view, that they will continue to do well.
And would there have been a time where Northern Quarter would not have been on your kind of, you know, go-to place? You know, if we went back, you know, you'd have to go back a few years, but I suppose new areas or new places come onto the radar, you know, as your decisions change, but also as their performance improves. Is that?
Yeah, and I think, you know, you have to look at the fundamentals of the place.
Yeah.
And understand, you know, what are the drivers that are going to make that place successful. So I think it's having that kind of foresight and, you know, doing the right research and really understanding the locality before making those investment decisions.
Nishan, and your thought on, you know, this, the pursuit of quality or the, you know, the drive of quality and what that means then for places that are, you know, further away from that position. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think that's where the whole point around that intentional repurposing comes into play, because I think the places will have to adapt and they will have to find better and optimum uses of the real estate, the property around. And we think, you know, there's a lot of the space will always be in demand, right? So, for example, with the recent trends, there's a lot of demand for logistic hubs.
Yes.
There's a lot of demand for energy storage places and things like that. So it's you know, we really need to be thoughtful and intelligent on how we can optimize the usage of the space, you know, not only from the traditional users of either residential or office spaces, but also these new industries that are coming up, but also from a leisure and entertainment perspective as well, because that's again an important factor which makes it an experience, for the residents, for the community, right? So I think that's equally important.
Yeah, well, I think, and that touches on the last question I wanted to get your views on. Maybe start with you, Natalie, which is, you know, what can cities do to be attractive to businesses like yours? You know, in a sense, what is it that they need to show you, as it were, as Grosvenor, to for you to take a second look or a third look and ultimately, you know, maybe invest in them? What is it you're looking for?
Yeah, it's the golden question.
It is. Tell them.
But I think, you know, we've touched on some of the things already, but it's the fundamentals of the place. So what are they going to offer to occupiers, whether it's commercial or residential? So infrastructure is very important, the transport network, connectivity, you know, demand from businesses and talent to be in those locations. And I think the quality of the buildings is actually very important. So to your earlier question, we wouldn't have bought the building in the Northern Quarter if it wasn't the correct kind of building for us and didn't have the characteristics that we were looking for. So it's a multitude of factors.
Yeah, but it's never to forget the underlying kind of fundamentals of the place and whether that, in a sense, provides an attractive proposition before you get into then questions about certain neighbourhoods or certain buildings or certain sites. Nishan, your thought, I mean, you know, from HSBC's point of view, I mean, what is it the cities can do to, you know, to catch the eye of HSBC?
Well, HSBC, as most people would know, is a global bank, and you know we're present in 65 markets and over 300 cities, and I think what we are increasingly seeing are business districts evolving into innovation districts. So moving from 9 to 6, 5 days a week to 7 days a week, 18 to 24 hours a week kind of a thing. You know, from commercial office space to highly mixed use space, wide range of layouts as well. And then to the earlier point Natalie mentioned around flexible leases for different companies in different circumstances. And then a focus on placemaking, proximity, and sort of amenities around the office space, and overall a collaboration environment, essentially community builders and an ecosystem connectors, right? So this is how we see cities and business districts evolve into innovation districts, and we see elements of that, especially in the City of London, for example, which is very much on track for that. And we see that across the globe in large, well-developed cities globally, from the Far East, for example, Asia Pacific, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Beijing, and to Western cities as well. One of the points I also wanted to differentiate here was that there are differences in different regions, for example. So being HSBC, we see that our colleagues are much more back in office in Asia Pac in the East.
Yes.
Whereas in the West, Europe and US, it's a little bit more staggered and a little bit more hybrid for now. So there are those differences there, emerging markets versus developed markets and things like that. So I think what we see is that, as I mentioned before, cities have been resilient for centuries
Indeed.
now, have been the concentration of sort of the growth engine for the economies. And we have no doubt that it will continue to do so. So HSBC would be very much present in these cities, supporting its clients and customers as partners. And we were very much committed to the business districts.
Very good. A good message to end on. Thank you very much to my brilliant guests, Nishant and Natalie. And thank you all for listening. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.